good evening, everyone. I'm Bob Bellemare. Several of you probably know me already. I see a lot of familiar faces, but I see some new ones. I'm a consultant to Excel Energy. I've been working on this since 2011. Been involved in a lot of these kind of forums, trying to share information and my perspective from having worked on most of these cases around the country. I've been involved not just Boulder, but a lot of cases in Florida, Washington State, California, and those types of things. It's not a common thing, as most of you know. There's over 3,000 electric utilities in this country, most reformed in the early 1900s, and different than what you're proposing to do here, which is a condemnation process. So what I hope to do tonight is share with you a couple of topics. Picking up on Ken, I'll talk a little bit about this cash flow in a little more detail, at least my observations, and also a legal update. One thing I'm, just in my conversations with people in the community, even people who track this issue, I think there's a lot of misperceptions about the legal process itself and where it's at and where it's going, or where it likely goes. I'm not an attorney, but I've been through these. I've been the expert witness on engineering and valuation issues. Those are the initials by my name. I'm a certified professional engineer, certified appraiser. Do a lot of work with utilities, not just on this. I do a lot of work in recently in combined heat and power, and I actually opposite up one case like that, and solar and things of that type as well. I actually live in Albuquerque, but my second home is a plane, and I got to experience that joy today. I was in Florida this morning. It was 85 degrees, and
thank you.
My flight got canceled because of that storm in Dallas, so I had to get up and been up since about 1 o'clock to get here. And my third home is probably Boulder, Denver, not just because of Excel, but because I have a lot of family in this area as well. So I'm up here a lot, and I love Colorado and this area. So I appreciate being here tonight, and want to give you some color on, I guess I'm controlling the slides. I'm not as adept probably as you are on this. So again, these are my opinions. I just want to make it clear, because I'm an appraiser, I'm not putting a value on anything, I'm talking about financial stuff. So I'm just trying to share with you, my insights and hopefully give you some information you can use. And I'm basing my statements on, what I see in here and what's on Boulder's website. So 3 basic topic areas. Let's start with the legal. So when you're trying to form a utility, there's 3 big questions that you have to answer. And as of today, we have no answers to these 3 questions, except for maybe how we're going to get the answers now going forward. The 3 big questions are: what are you buying? How are we going to separate the system? And how much is it going to cost? Okay. Now, as far as I know, no one's challenging Boulder's authority, legal right to form a utility. So you shouldn't expect any of the parties involved here, from a court or the Public Utility Commission or the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, they're not there to tell Boulder you can't form a utility. They're there to determine those questions, the answers to those questions. And so when I step through this, really the end result of it is that as of today, there's the process going forward is that we will be, likely engaging in the district court level for condemnation, the Public Utility Commission to help determine what assets Boulder will be buying, because it has implications for customers outside of Boulder, and also how the system will be separated. Then the third issue would be the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and they generally will look at what's called stranded costs, which is potentially a big number here. You're talking hundreds of millions of dollars potentially. That would be the case before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, as well as if Boulder has a proposal to buy the transmission loop in this area. It's roughly over 30 miles of high voltage line, and that line serves both in and outside Boulder, and FERC has weighed in and said, we need to approve that if you go down that road. That's actually a federal issue. So a very complicated process. What has happened to date, there's been I think about 6 legal issues to try to lay out this. Boulder in 2013 asked FERC to rule on a scenario where Boulder was seeking, I believe, a zero stranded cost ruling, and FERC denied that without prejudice. Basically, in my view, what that means is come back when you have a real plan. And what stranded costs, I'll talk a little more about stranded costs in a minute, just so you understand that a little better, but it will be a big issue in this case, likely down the road. The other thing was in 2013, Xcel Energy sought clarification from the Public Utility Commission on this issue of can Boulder buy what it wants, or does it have to go through a process with the Utility Commission? Also at that time, Boulder was planning to serve into the county, about 6,000 to 8,000 customers. And the Colorado Public Utility Commission came back and said, you need to come here first before you file condemnation. And we will work to determine what you can buy. But as far as serving into the county, the criteria there is only if Xcel is unwilling or unable to serve those, can you serve into the county, okay? So Boulder then appealed that ruling, and that was a recent ruling out of district court. I'll get to that in a minute. In 2014, also Xcel asked for clarification from FERC on the transmission issue, and FERC sided with Xcel Energy that Boulder must get approval from FERC in order to acquire the transmission assets. The other thing that happened is Mr. Murphy filed a CORA request for additional information on the modeling. We'll talk about that in a minute. On the eve of the trial, this was released on the case of the hearing, which we'll talk about, and then there are some insights from that I'll share with you and pick up on some comments that Kent made. Recently, I think it was last month, the district court rejected the appeal by Boulder of the PUC ruling. So Boulder is now directed to go to the Public Utility Commission. And Boulder has since decided not to appeal that, because they could appeal that to the state Supreme Court if they had wanted to. But they decided to go and work through the PUC process. So that's the critical next step in this. And I gotta be, I've been involved with separation in other cases. My experience with it is it's normally at least a 6-month process to a year to work through those kind of details. My remark has always been, if you give 3 engineers that problem, you get 3 different answers. And so, there's a lot in that. Obviously, you want to set up, if there is a separate system, you want to set it up so both parties can reliably operate and manage the system using normal industry practices. And, what one does can have impact on the other. But I want to make it clear, as far as I'm aware, the PUC doesn't tell Boulder what to do within the city limit. The Boulder could decide to have 1 transformer substation, 2, it could decide wherever it wants. It's mainly focused on the remaining customers, would be my view, is to making sure they are not impacted by, this separation scenario. But once, whatever that decision is, Boulder itself can decide what it would do within the assets it can buy and how to serve its customers. I don't think that would be the Public Utility Commission, because somebody was asking me whether or not the PUC actually would tell Boulder how to run its system, and that's not normally the case. As Ken pointed out, the municipalities are unregulated and generally self-ruling, okay? So the key thing there will be, how the remaining customers will be served. Any assets that are involved in that would likely be part of the discussion here. Boulder did file a condemnation case last year. Now that they've been directed to the PUC, this was a separate legal case. Same judge was involved in this case, and she ruled that, dismiss that case, because it makes sense. You got to go to the PUC first now to find out what you're buying before you can go to court to get a price tag on it. Okay, does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So first you got to go to the Public Utility Commission, then the condemnation court to put a price tag on those assets that you're acquiring. And I think likely any damages, what is that separation cost and that type of thing. Xcel would have to be made whole, Xcel's customers, for any cost Xcel would incur to reknit the system. So a cost for that. And then again, the other big component would be the stranded cost, which would be the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission area. Any questions on that? There are 2 outstanding cases that I'm aware of. Excel filed a lawsuit. Boulder did created an electric utility last year on paper. And the nature of that case is that it's premature because all the financial modeling to date in here is based on the assumption that they would serve into the county and acquire the transmission assets. Don't shake your head though, it's true. This has 1.6 billion kilowatt hours. It includes county load, okay? So,
that's not all the modeling, that's one out of 720.
Well, where's the other 728 cases? We'll get to that in a second. So, continuation of the solar energy efficiency programs in Boulder. This is a case in front of the Public Utility Commission right now. Because these are long-term investments, there's a question that's been raised: how do these programs continue? Because all customers participate in this in terms of paying for it, and Boulder's been a heavy user, obviously, of these programs, and it's been one of the great, I think, things of the relationship, between Excel Energy and the city. Boulder has, I think, over 14 megawatts of solar, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that's a lot compared to national averages. It's roughly 3 to 4% of the energy in Boulder today comes from solar. And I think there's really exciting things going on. The solar energy costs have come down. Utility scale solar is amazingly priced right now, around 5 cents a kilowatt hour in this region. So a lot of good things going on in the solar industry, especially utility scale solar, I would say. But even locally here, we have about 14, maybe more megawatts by now. I think that was a number from a year ago too. So let's talk about cash flow. So what is a cash flow? And well, you might do this at home. It's basically your checkbook. You're trying to figure out, you got money coming in, you got money going out. Hopefully at the end of the year, you're not taking out loans to cover any losses. If there's losses, we generally throw out whatever financial decision that is. If you really expect you're going to have financial losses, at the end of the day, you throw out your decision. So this is a common way we look at making financial decisions. If the results are positive, in other words, you think you're going to make some money, then you have to look at the numbers and decide whether or not the risk involved and all those types of things are worth whatever endeavor you're embarking on. So this is the underpinning from municipalization cases and other financial decisions. You look to a cash flow and you try to run your assumptions and see what they look like. The challenge, not just in Boulder, but in most cases I've been involved with, is you don't know a dollar of these items, with certainty. There's nothing today in this cash flow that is known there's no number here that's locked down. And the challenge in these cases is the big ticket item that he was bringing up, this production cost, which could be 70% of your cost structure, is the number one cost item. You're usually not in a position to lock into that until you're about 6 months from actually forming the utility. Because the shelf life of a quote can normally be, at best, is normally 6 months, in the wholesale market. So it's always been a big issue in any case because beyond even what you're going to pay to form the utility, this is like your big risk. What are you actually going to pay? And if you think it's going to be cheap, then what you're saying is stranded costs are probably high, and I'll get to that in a minute. But the reason is the way we calculate stranded costs is it's based on the market price of energy. So if you think your market price of energy is 5 cents a kilowatt hour, and Excel's, let's say, average rate is 6.5, you're going to owe Excel for the difference. That's the nature of stranded costs. And so it becomes a catch-22 in the financial modeling if you assume stranded costs are in play. So anyway, that's been a challenge that I see in these models. I mean, you could talk a lot about a lot of the micro issues, but the big issue is where you're going to get your power from, how much is it going to cost, what is stranded cost, and how much are you going to pay. And unfortunately, all that comes together towards the end, not at the beginning. So, and by that time, a lot of times the cities are too vested, they're too deeply into it. And that's one of the challenges, we talk about off-ramps and stuff like that. It's a challenge, because you can keep playing these models to say whatever, in a way, give yourself whatever you want. So the normal thing that I've seen, and Boulder did in 2011, is you don't just have a piece of paper, but you have full documentation behind the paper. Every assumption, every calculation, not hard to read, not hard for us to model and pick up. We usually can understand these in detail. And that hasn't been the case here since 2011. Yes, there is a lot of information out there, but not a line-by-line detailed calculation of how they came up with each number in this cash flow. So, in fact, we didn't even have a cash flow until January of this year. If you go on the website, there's only a few, there's inputs, there's some outputs, but not a year-by-year illustration of what you think your numbers will be. So normally our conversation is about, well, are the assumptions right? You know, or the debate is on what the assumptions are. So in the court case, where are some representations? Boulder does not have the model. Do you have there's two big engines in here. There's a product called Homer that's used for production costing model. That's 70% of the cost structure. And you put inputs in, you get outputs out. It's a fine piece of software. It's a local company. You know, it's no problem with the software. It's just that it's being used here to do a heavy lifting on carbon emissions, on costing, and that type of thing. And then there's another software, DPL, which is used to run the 700-something scenarios that were brought up. So DPL is a tool you can use, a software you can use to run with Excel, not the company Excel, the spreadsheet, and run. Yes, you want to say?
Since I've had extensive modeling background, then I want to ask you, have you used DPL?
I've not used DPL.
Okay.
But I'm not saying it's bad or good. I'm just saying it's
okay.
Can I get you to wait and right when he's done?
Yeah, so anyway, these software products are not expensive. $1,495 for a professional license for DPL and $3,000 at most for Homer. There's even free versions. So, as someone who does a lot of modeling, I just have always had copies of my models, and results. So this was surprising to me, as I think for others. So here's the 729 runs. So there were 729 runs of this, and this is a quote from the city, none of which are captured outside of what we have here. This is what we have. This is what you have. That's it, in your possession, okay? Now it is the low-cost case. It does, tell us a lot of things. And then the representation here was in the later document put out by the city that it was never made past the draft stage, has only one output obtained from a partial run of the modeling process. So that's what we're looking at here. And it was not loaded on the city website for fear that it might cause more confusion. So, these are representations made about this. The reason it's important is when you look at this at a high level from the modeling that Boulder has done, we're looking at very small differences between the assumptions of Excel's economics going forward and the city of Boulder. It really amounts to a 5% difference, okay? So all the benefits are being talked about financially and all this stuff is only about so in other words, a 5% change in the cost here basically makes the model red, financially red. So it's important to have this conversation and debate about the assumptions and what's in it. And is everything calculated right? This is very complex. Anybody who's been involved with modeling knows it's easy to make a software error. It's easy to make an input error. I'm not saying anybody intentionally does these things. Nobody does that. Everybody wants to do a good result. But it's important to have an audit trail. It's important to be able to know what your numbers are, not just assume it's all working well. So in the low-cost case, the lowest of low-cost case, which is here, basically we're looking at only a 5% difference over 20 years, and that drives a lot of the numbers and things that you hear, at least from the economic perspective. So what are some of the big things, if you boil down this cash flow, and going back to this notion of lower rates day one. So in the model here, what you have is what's called a revenue requirement. And so if you add up all the costs that you brought up, and that's what this model represents. In the first year, because Boulder is not making a debt payment, the average rate would have to be at least 9.3 or so cents per kilowatt hour. And this is a little deceiving. Actually, it would jump in the middle of the year because they start making debt payments in the middle of the second year. Would actually jump up to somewhere around 12 cents a kilowatt hour and then up from there. So this is the point Kent was bringing up that, is this the metric or not? But regardless, let me just give you another data point. Today's 2014, the average rate in Boulder from Excel Energy across all customers, you add up all revenue divided by kilowatt hours, was around 9.6 cents a kilowatt hour, okay? With the recent settlement that Excel made, and I'm not sure if it's been approved yet on the rate case, which would take rates to 2017. 2017 is only a couple years away. Excel's rates would be, under that settlement, roughly about 9.8 cents a kilowatt hour in Boulder. Now, this is much lower than Excel's average, reason being, as Kent brought up, 80% of the load in Boulder's these big customers. So 80% of Boulder's are very unique in this respect. About 80% of the load is commercial and industrial. And they have, because they have a lower cost of service, they have a lower rate. So, you know, and of course things can happen between now and 2017. Fuel can change and other things, but reasonably, Excel's rates don't seem like they would be anywhere near what was assumed in Boulder's model, which really was about 11.25 starting in 2017. Now, there is a carbon tax assumed there that doesn't exist. Without a carbon tax, the assumption was about 10.75, if I remember. And then they go up from there. So if you just take this model and you just plug in 10 cents instead of 11, I'll tell you it would have a dramatically different result. All the same assumptions, just change the starting point. You would not be financially feasible, okay? So this is why models are important to have. You, as a community, need to decide what you believe. You know, I'm here to provide, I'm trying to provide you information, but if you don't have the model and you can't run it, it's hard to show the scenarios, you know, that you might want to look at. But this, I just tell you one thing, one change, rate, right there seems to be far off in this model. The other thing that was represented everywhere on the website is that these are 30-year bonds, okay? And when you look at the model, though, I can't make heads or tails out of the debt service payment, and Boulder was asked this question: why do you have debt payments dropping in year 14? It starts in year 14, and it's not trivial. It goes from 33 million a year to 29 million a year. This is the debt payment that's not in the rates day one. And then it just keeps dropping, and it represents 30-year notes. Okay. So, you know, questions like this: where did this model come from? The city could not answer it. They said it were 15-year notes. Well, 15-year notes don't explain this even. They're not 30. But then that contradicts what's on the web. So, this is the second largest cost item in your cash flow, and can't answer how it's calculated. Can't find it on the web. So, I know you didn't ask the city the question, but it was asked by Pat, and that was the response. So, and they said we'd have to do a lot of work to find out how it was calculated. So this is the second largest cash flow item, and we don't know how it's calculated. Somebody does, I would hope, but you can't find it. And it's a big number. Now, going back to this IOU muni thing, the difference. The bonds are very important. The bond covenants are very important. And Boulder has correctly done this in the model. There's two big requirements in a bond. One is what's called debt coverage ratio. I know that sounds techie talk, but you got to have a certain amount of money in reserves, or else they don't rate your bond well. And so that's in here. You have to cover all your costs. So you start from a bottom-up design in this. This is what this model represents. What's the total revenue I have to make in order to meet the bond covenants? How you split up that money is rate making, okay? Rate making, let's talk about that. So in other cases I've been involved with, I've never heard of people trying to design rates day one to do anything. Because they make a commitment. We're going to have lower rates in Excel Energy. There's only one way to assure that. And other cities have promised this. I'm going to take Excel's logo off, erase it off their tariff documents, I'm going to put the city of on. And that's the only way you know as a customer that you're going to have lower rates and not have this cost shifting and things of that type. So rate making becomes an issue. The challenge is, and this happened in Jefferson County, Washington, where I worked on, turned into more of a voluntary sale, but 2 years into their forming of a utility, they finally did a rate design study, and you'll have quotes from, we didn't even know what our costs are, we still don't even know what our costs are. 2 years into forming the utility, because the bills are still coming in. So it is a challenge, and these are things you'll have to tackle. So anyway, are there options? I just want to switch gears here to go back to the 2013 task force report, because I know carbon, obviously, the goal of this community is to get to carbon reduction. Everybody respects that. There's ways to get there without forming a utility. You know, there are alternatives. And I know Pat probably was going to talk about some. I know he's picked up on some. But in 2013, there was a task force that looked at options. And what it was showing, let's see here. The black line is what Boulder has assumed in their model for Excel's carbon emissions going forward. It's based on the 2011 Energy Resource Plan, which is the most current one. But renewables have greatly dropped in price even from that plan. And so Excel is trying to take advantage of that. And they're actually ahead of that. And the red line was where Excel felt like the track that they were actually on, you know, going forward. And then with a little bit more renewables added, this is where they would go. The blue line is an 80% reduction in carbon. Okay, so Excel has, like Pat's counted out, 15 to 16 coal plants are retiring in this period or being taken out. Those are the big jumps you see down at times. And so with a little bit of partnership, obviously this could be made even more aggressive, you know, between Boulder and Excel. This is the trajectory they're on. Probably will end up here reasonably expected if renewable prices stay low. There are tax credit issues right now and things like that that could impact it. And of course, natural gas coming down in price doesn't help the economics, unfortunately, at the moment. But long-term view, though, is, you know, so this stuff is getting very competitive with what we would call conventional generation. And that's been my critique. I think a lot of this is going to happen whether Boulder forms a utility or not. So what are you really contributing to? If you really look at Boulder's plan, it amounts to this, and this was part of the study, 200 megawatts of new wind or solar, whatever it is. That if you want to meet your carbon reduction goal that you've put out there, it's essentially a 200 megawatts of renewable kind of plan. That's basically what Boulder's fuel mix boils down to in the studies. And I think we can do that somehow without forming a utility. It was offered in 2011. I know that deal was rushed. It was the wind deal that everybody talks about. But this is what you're really realistically looking at as, you know, how do you get from here to there? And there's many ways to do that. It doesn't have to be one project. It could be a lot of things. But what came out of that task force in 2013, as I know a lot of people aren't familiar with it, there were 8 offerings for future exploration. And the idea was this was, you know, the first 4 or 5, I would say, are nice. I call them ornaments on the tree. But they're not going to get you to dramatic carbon reduction in a short amount of time. They are things to work on. They would be positive things. But what would be the trunk of the tree? You basically have 3 ways to reduce carbon if you want to pursue them. One is what we would call the green city rate. And some citizens have picked up on this recently where, well, what if we just did wind source citywide? You know, buy wind, have a rate that you can buy into or whatever. The program's not structured that way. I'm not saying that would be the program, but something of that type, like what if you take a program off the shelf, modify it, create an option for a city so they could buy into a certain amount of fuel. A lot of complexity there. It would take change, but it was certainly being discussed. This was on the table. You could switch from coal to gas is another way. And in our language, we call it redispatch, because we call that function dispatch within the utility. So fundamentally, and really this is another element of Boulder's plan, if you look at it from a fuel mix perspective, you're switching from coal to gas. Now some don't find, all these have pluses and minuses. And we could stand here all night talking about them. From a cost perspective, whether they're real or not, you know, those kind of things, people have emotional issues about these, and you know, there's a lot of details to be worked out to do these things, but there was a willingness at least to look forward. And then, you know, buying essentially directly into projects, wind, solar, and those types of things. As far as I know, none of these have been offered in the country. You know, so people say nothing's been talked about, nothing's been done. These are substantial industry changes if we were able to somehow work through something. Now it's very hard to do. You know, my phrase is, it's hard to talk marriage when you're in divorce court. You know, it just is so messy. You know, because, oh, I can't say this here because it might be in court, and you get into all this kind of junk that stands in the way from finding the marriage, you know, but there is potential for a marriage. I think, personally, I think the risks and benefits of these can be much better than pursuing this option. That's an opinion. I know, but everything I know about this stuff says, you know, this would be my first instinct, not my, you know, rather than forming a utility, to think you're going to do this, because I don't see any inherent advantage to having a utility. It doesn't change the price of gas, doesn't change the price of solar much, doesn't do any of those things. I think you can take advantage of both the strengths of both parties to create some of these industry first things, which I think will create more industry change than a model of trying to form a utility and go on your own, which most cities can't replicate. So anyway, those are my comments, and happy to take questions. Tom?
I have a question. Can you go back to that slide where you were showing the current price of Excel?
Yeah.
Do you understand that the 2017 number is an inflated number, and that your price is not an inflated number?
This is the actual, right? The model's based on
this. That's the actual now, or in 2010?
No, this is the actual now, so it says 2014.
Okay, but the 2017 number from the city is an inflated number.
Right, but it runs your whole model.
No, it's in inflated number. It's at 2.5% inflation. Those are in 2017 dollars.
Well, it's already 2015.
Yeah.
But it does make that much difference. It's about a penny, which you think is not much, but if you look on that chart, if you look at that chart, your Excel number is now 10.5 cents.
But that's not what the rates will be in 2017. You assume the rates would inflate at inflation.
Well, in that case, we have to de-inflate the 2017 number for the city. You're comparing apples and oranges. The other thing, what you're not adding into this average Boulder rate is the cost of those programs you were just talking about. What do those things cost?
What do you mean?
They're going to cost the city of Boulder something, right?
Well, that's on the cost side here. That's part of this.
No, I'm not talking about for our utility. I'm talking about our alternative, which is the status quo use.
Oh, yeah.
We can be married and pay extra
no, I understand
for
that.
these
No, I mean,
things.
and they have different cost implications. Like, I didn't mention like renewable energy credits, right? So some of these things can be inexpensive. Some of them can be.
Is that in your average rate? It's not.
Well, that's an alternative. If you're going to pay, let's say Boulder's rates will be 12 and Excel's at 10. For that 2 cent difference, why would you do that if you could just work it?
You're comparing apples and oranges. That's not Boulder's rate if you're putting in extra for these added surfaces and you have inflation. You're comparing to the city's numbers that do have inflation in them. That 2018 number is an inflated number.
I disagree. I just don't. These are your numbers of your cost basis.
Those are all inflated at 2.5%.
Well, that was your study. I mean, but that's, yeah, go ahead, Liz.
Hi, Bob. So I'm interested in collaboration. I'm interested in a win-win. I'm interested in reducing our carbon footprint above and beyond anything else.
Right.
So I'm interested in what the experience in our country has been when there has been some collaboration between the current municipal city and the utility company, what kind of, what anecdotally can you share with us
Well,
that success?
It's actually a new issue in the industry. You know, generally you have customer choice. So like wind source, you can go on wind source tomorrow. You can put solar on your house. The question is at a community level, does a community make that choice somehow for its community, right? So today you have individual choice. And then you have the standard programs that are approved by the Public Utility Commission. I'm talking about an investor-owned scenario. Does that make sense? So the notion of a community picking its fuel mix is actually kind of new. There are some models of it in deregulated states, like California. There's what they call community choice aggregation, which is somewhat a close cousin, but it's not quite a perfect cousin because of the structure. But the notion is, this is all pioneering stuff. I think that's why, but communities do partner. I mean, Excel's partnering with Minneapolis. It's a different process. They've, I would say, set up the framework to get somewhere. It's not, it doesn't define like, oh, we're going to do a wind deal or we're going to do whatever. But that franchise was pretty unique in that it set up a framework to try to get from here to there with the city of Minneapolis. I think it's just an emerging issue in the industry, so, yeah.
So is it safe to say that we could be a leader in actually creating?
Well, that's my point, right. Yeah. I don't know of these programs anywhere else. I mean, I've looked for them. There are some cousins, close cousins, but not what has been discussed here. So yes, I do think it is. It is, because everybody thinks they can get it cheaper, or if you think you're going to make money forming a utility, why am I going to pay more to do that? You know, those things all come into play. But yeah, it's a good question. I think there's a way to resolve it, though. It takes work.
Yeah, well, do any of these solutions and proposed solutions, do they really have an impact on the global scale? And particularly, are they just Boulder-centric? Are we just getting to the point where we're saying we're green? Or are we just transferring the pollution to something else?
Well, it depends on the program. So yeah, so for example, if you did coal to gas dispatch, right?
Right.
And all it did was free up coal to sell somewhere else.
Right.
Yeah, that wouldn't create.
Obviously,
right.
Have no impact on the global scale.
Correct.
Absolutely.
If that happened, yeah.
Right.
Now you can get at a high level, like if solar's cheap, which it is right now, utility scale solar.
Particularly utility.
Does it have really any impact? I mean, you can talk yourself into, hey, if the markets operate efficiently and they go to the lowest cost resources, they're going to put this stuff in anyway, is part of the challenge, right?
Right.
So the question is, what are you really doing? If you're, do we need more wind? Do we need more solar sooner than later? I mean, that's more of, I question that.
What I worry about it is there's only so much wind energy available throughout the United States.
Right.
And if we're buying more, then somebody else has less available.
No, I wouldn't say that, but what I would say, though, is if wind stays 5 cents a kilowatt hour, now it's less a tax credit, if solar stays 5 cents a kilowatt hour, this has been my critique of this study, if the prices are this cheap, right, for production, don't you think everybody will do it? I mean, yes, if a gas-solar mix becomes the cheapest thing, it's going to happen. So why are you, so that's to me the circular or catch-22 kind of thing. But you can accelerate maybe some of it. Maybe there is a project that wouldn't be built.
Actually, didn't that really happen? Where the wind farm, the XL proposed for Boulder.
Yeah.
And then when Boulder turned it down, XL said.
Yeah, that would have been, so under that proposal, what would have happened is Boulder would own what's called renewable energy credits from it.
Right.
So that it couldn't be counted towards anybody else's renewable portfolio standard. Or so Excel couldn't count those towards its 20% renewable, energy mix, or 30%. It's going to be, Excel's going to be 30% here, which by the way is industry leading, too, for a large utility. I don't know any major utility doing that. So they're at 22% today, and they've gone from almost zero in 10 years, which is pretty amazing. But the under that proposal, that would have been additive, in my viewpoint, because only Boulder could count the renewable credits from it. That makes sense. Right. And I know Pat has some more to say on that, but I think, that would be the notion of a project-based program. Rather than having to worry about all the electrons flowing and how that would be, you would get the renewable energy credits to retire. Or do what you want. You could resell them, but that would kind of defeat your purpose, right? Then you're giving it to somebody who can count them. Okay? Yes.
I'm just curious, are you familiar with Marin Clean's Energy?
Yes.
And the deregulation from PG&E in Northern California?
Yeah.
And how it's similar but different right here, where you could live in Marin and by default you're on Marin Clean Energy, but then you can say I want to opt out
right.
and go back to PG&E.
Right.
Because with Marin Clean Energy, you're going to source your power from
Correct.
wind, hydro, and solar, but they're going to charge you about 10% more for that energy.
I want to see how those programs play out long term, because solar and wind are long-term investments. So there's some green energy available now, but they could have a lot of volatility in price. That would just be my long-term concern in that program. But that's what it is. So you can opt in and out.
But could Excel and Boulder do such a thing?
It's never been done that I'm aware of. Where you can require people, let's say, to default to a green rate, like WindSource or something like that. But you have the option to opt out. Yeah, it would be like the Marin County kind of concept, yeah.
How about just one more question from Steve?
Yeah, Steve
Oh,
has.
Can you go back to your last slide? Is that possible?
Pardon me, to go back?
Yeah. You very.
Oh, that's okay. Maybe I can say it. Or is it-
Okay.
Because there's
Just
8
back
things.
to the green city option, offering the green city rate.
Mm-hmm.
From day one, I've been an advocate of that green city option. And I said the 2011 wind deal, it was last minute. It was not perfect. It was a starting point for the negotiation. As you've pointed out, it hasn't been done before. The 18 years I worked at NREL in support of the DOE wind program, NREL and Excel were involved in collaborative research efforts that had never been done before.
Right.
We gained understandings of how wind farms behaved, from like individual turbines to how the sum is greater than the parts. We got understandings on dispatch over big service territories because the wind is not the same everywhere. There's the wind forecasting model. There's a bunch of things. So, I mean...
Yeah, to that point, just to sum that up,
Yeah.
I would say 7, 8 years ago, we thought the most wind we could integrate on the system is 10% of our fuel
Right.
mix, right? And Excel's doing 20% here in Colorado. And a lot of it's been through these better forecasting methods that were developed cooperatively with the labs right near here.
Right.
And, you know, this is a big deal, you know, to advance it to even 20%. We thought that was the physical limitation. Now we're pressing through those barriers. Yes.
It's about collaboration.
Yeah.
That's my point.
This is not easy stuff. And I'll tell you, first of their kind programs, my experience with them, they're rough. I mean, everybody goes in them with good intentions, and then when you actually put them in practice, you learn a lot of things. But if you want to be a pioneer,
Yeah.
that's what you got to do, right?
Yeah, Excel's had some wind farms that got broken wind turbines. They learned the hard
Oh,
way.
yeah.
But they learned.
Right. But that's how you advance
Yeah.
things. And that's what I would say. These programs, if there were something to be able to be structured, that's what we would be doing. And do you want to be the pioneers? Yeah.
If I can ask
I
you,
actually
Wade.
have a question.
Yeah.
Well, not a comment, a question.
I've got a very short
Yeah.
presentation, and then we'll have
Yeah,
another
it's running
block
late
of
here.
time. Can you keep it? Can you hang on to it?